That crisp autumn morning in Denver, Colorado, the air was sharp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and distant snow from the Rocky Mountains. Margaret Chen stood at the arrivals gate of Denver International Airport, her carry-on bag at her feet, her heart swelling with the kind of joy only a mother can feel when she's about to see her child. At 62 years old, her hair was more silver than black now, pulled back in a practical bun, and her hands, weathered from years of work in double shifts as a nurse, clutched the handle of her small suitcase. Inside that suitcase were carefully wrapped gifts: a hand-knitted sweater for her son, homemade almond cookies, his favorite since childhood, and a jade pendant that had belonged to her own mother. Margaret had saved for months to afford this trip. Her son Daniel had moved to Denver 3 years ago after landing a prestigious position as a software engineer at a major tech company. 3 years. It had been 3 long years since she'd seen him in person. Video calls were nice, but they couldn't replace a mother's embrace, couldn't let her see with her own eyes that her boy was truly happy and healthy. Daniel had always been her pride and joy, her only child, born after years of hoping and praying. His father had passed away when Daniel was just 12, a sudden heart attack that had left Margaret a widow far too young. From that moment on, it had been just the two of them against the world. She had worked herself to exhaustion to put him through college, had celebrated every achievement as if it were her own, had cried tears of joy at his graduation. When Daniel met Sarah 4 years ago, Margaret had been cautiously optimistic. Sarah was beautiful, with cascading auburn hair and a smile that seemed to light up rooms. She came from a wealthy family, worked in marketing, and seemed sophisticated in ways that sometimes made Margaret feel small and unsophisticated. But Daniel loved her, that was clear, and Margaret had told herself that was all that mattered. The wedding had been a grand affair, far grander than anything Margaret could have contributed to financially. Sarah's parents had paid for everything, a fact that Sarah's mother had mentioned more than once in Margaret's presence. Margaret had sewn her own dress for the occasion, a simple navy blue affair that had looked plain next to the designer gowns of the other guests. But she had smiled through it all because Daniel was happy. Now, standing in the Denver airport, Margaret felt a flutter of nervousness she couldn't quite explain. She had deliberately not told Daniel she was coming. She wanted it to be a surprise, wanted to see the pure, unguarded joy on his face when he opened the door and found her standing there. She had texted Sarah a week ago, just a simple message saying she might be in the area and asking if they'd be home this weekend. Sarah had responded with a brief yes, no elaboration, no invitation, but no discouragement either. Margaret had taken that as permission enough. The ride from the airport to Daniel's neighborhood took 40 minutes. Margaret watched the city pass by through the taxi window, marveling at the modern buildings, the clean streets, the mountains looming in the distance like ancient guardians. Daniel and Sarah lived in Cherry Creek, an upscale neighborhood that made Margaret's modest apartment back in Sacramento seem like a closet by comparison. The houses here were massive, with manicured lawns and expensive cars in circular driveways. When the taxi pulled up in front of the address Daniel had given her, Margaret's breath caught. The house was stunning, a contemporary design with large windows, stone accents, and a perfectly landscaped front yard. This was her son's home. Her Danny, who used to play with toy cars on their cramped apartment floor, now lived in a house that looked like it belonged in a magazine. Pride and something else, something she didn't want to examine too closely, maybe inadequacy, twisted in her chest. She paid the taxi driver, adding a generous tip she couldn't really afford, and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, gathering her courage. Why was she nervous? This was her son, her Danny. She had changed his diapers, had stayed up all night when he had fevers, had taught him to ride a bike and to be kind to others. She had every right to visit him. Margaret walked up the pristine pathway to the front door, her small suitcase wheels clicking against the pavers. She raised her hand to knock, then noticed the doorbell, one of those modern video ones. She pressed it, hearing a melodious chime echo inside, and then she waited. No answer. She rang again, listening intently. She could hear sounds from inside, movement, maybe voices. Her heart began to beat a little faster. Were they home? Was Daniel all right? She tried the doorknob, and to her surprise, it turned. The door was unlocked. Margaret hesitated for only a moment before pushing it open. "Hello," she called out, her voice sounding small in the grand entryway. "Daniel, Sarah, it's Mom. I wanted to surprise you." The interior of the house was even more impressive than the exterior. High ceilings, hardwood floors that gleamed, modern furniture that looked like it had never been sat on, and artwork on the walls that probably cost more than Margaret made in a year. But something was wrong. She could feel it. The sounds she'd heard from outside were clearer now. Footsteps, rapid and purposeful. Coming from upstairs, the sound of drawers opening and closing. "Hello," she called again, louder this time, setting her suitcase down and moving toward the staircase. "Is anyone home? Who's there?" A sharp voice, definitely Sarah's, came from the second floor. There was an edge to it, something brittle and panicked. "It's Margaret," she called back. "Daniel's mother. I came to surprise you both. Is everything all right?" There was a pause, a long moment of silence that made Margaret's skin prickle with unease. Then Sarah appeared at the top of the stairs. "Before we dig deep into this story, I always ask you to keep supporting our channel. If you haven't yet, make sure you hit the like button. And so you don't miss any of our most exciting and recent narratives. Subscribe and activate the notification bell while you wait. I'd love to know where you're watching from. Please write your name and your city in the comments below. Thank you all so much." All right, back to the story. Margaret barely recognized her. Sarah looked haggard, her usually perfect hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, her face pale and bare of makeup, her eyes red-rimmed and wild. She wore yoga pants and an oversized sweatshirt, clothes Margaret had never seen her in before. Sarah had always been immaculately dressed during their video calls. "Margaret," Sarah said, her voice flat, "what are you doing here?" "I wanted to surprise Daniel," Margaret said slowly, her maternal instinct screaming that something was terribly, terribly wrong. "Is he home? Is he all right?" Sarah laughed, a sound that was more like a bark, sharp and bitter. "Is he all right? That's rich. That's really rich." "Sarah, what's going on?" Margaret moved to the bottom of the stairs, gripping the banister. "Where is Daniel?" "Your precious son," Sarah said, practically spitting the words, "is exactly where he deserves to be." "I don't understand," Margaret said, her heart beginning to hammer in her chest. "Please, you're scaring me. Where is my son?" Sarah turned without answering and disappeared down the hallway. Margaret didn't hesitate. She climbed the stairs, her legs trembling, following the sound of Sarah's footsteps. The upstairs hallway was lined with closed doors. Sarah had gone into one of the rooms at the end, and Margaret could hear her moving around inside. She reached the doorway and stopped, her hand flying to her mouth. It was clearly the master bedroom, massive and beautifully decorated, but it looked like a tornado had torn through it. The bed was unmade, clothes were strewn everywhere, and Sarah was standing in front of a closet, yanking Daniel's clothes off hangers and throwing them into a large cardboard box on the floor. Another box, already full, sat nearby. "What are you doing?" Margaret whispered. Sarah didn't look at her, just kept pulling clothes down, her movements jerky and violent. "What does it look like I'm doing? I'm packing his things, getting rid of every trace of him." "Why?" The word came out as a sob. "Why would you do that? Where is Daniel?" Sarah finally stopped, her hands clutching a shirt, Daniel's favorite blue button-down that Margaret had given him for his birthday 2 years ago. Sarah turned, and the look on her face was pure venom. "You want to know where your son is, Margaret? You really want to know?" "Yes," Margaret said, tears beginning to stream down her face. "Please, Sarah, just tell me what's happening." Sarah took a step closer, and Margaret could see that she'd been crying too. Her eyes weren't just red, they were swollen, and there were tracks down her cheeks where tears had dried and been replaced by new ones. "Your son," Sarah said, her voice low and shaking with rage, "is in jail." The world tilted. Margaret reached out, grabbing the doorframe to keep from falling. "What? No, that's not possible. There's been a mistake. Daniel would never—" "Never what?" Sarah interrupted, her voice rising. "Never commit fraud. Never embezzle money from his own company. Never forge documents and steal proprietary information to sell to competitors? No, Margaret said, shaking her head violently. No, that's not true. My Daniel wouldn't do that. He's a good boy. He's honest. He would never. Your good boy, Sarah said, and now she was shouting, is facing federal charges. Your honest son is looking at 15 years in prison. The FBI showed up here 3 days ago, Margaret. They had a warrant. They seized his computers, his files, everything, and then they arrested him right here in this house in front of me. Margaret couldn't breathe. The room was spinning. This couldn't be real. This had to be some kind of nightmare. There's been a mistake, she whispered. Some misunderstanding. Daniel is innocent. He has to be. Sarah laughed again, that awful broken sound. Innocent? They have evidence, Margaret. Mountains of it. Financial records, emails, money transfers. Your son has been stealing from his company for over a year. Do you know how much? Over $2 million. $2 million. The number was incomprehensible. Margaret sank to her knees right there in the doorway, her legs simply giving out. No, she moaned. No, no, no. Yes, Sarah said, her voice now cold and distant. And you want to know the best part? I had no idea. I thought we were living on his salary. I thought he was just really good at his job. Turns out he was really good at being a criminal. Sarah, please. Margaret looked up at her daughter-in-law through her tears. There has to be an explanation. Maybe someone framed him. Maybe... Stop it, Sarah snapped. Just stop. I spent the last 3 days trying to convince myself of the same things. But the evidence doesn't lie, Daniel confessed. Margaret, he confessed to everything. The words hit Margaret like physical blows. Confessed. Daniel had confessed. Her son, her beautiful boy, had admitted to crimes that would destroy his life. Why? She whispered. Why would he do this? Sarah's face crumpled, and for a moment, the anger gave way to pure anguish. I don't know. I've been asking myself that question for 3 days straight. We had everything. This house, good jobs, a good life. Why wasn't it enough? She grabbed another shirt from the closet, this time more slowly, her hands trembling. I need you to leave, Margaret. Leave, but I need to see Daniel. I need to talk to him. Maybe I can help. Maybe you can't help him, Sarah said, her voice breaking. Nobody can, and I need you to leave this house. I can't look at anything that reminds me of him right now. I can't. She pressed her hand to her mouth, stifling a sob. Margaret pulled herself to her feet, her body feeling ancient and frail. Sarah, please, you're my daughter-in-law. We're family. Let me help you. Let me... Family? Sarah's head snapped up. You want to talk about family? Your son lied to me every single day. He looked me in the eyes and lied. He put me at risk, Margaret. The FBI questioned me for hours. They thought I might be involved. Do you know how humiliating that was? How terrifying? I'm sorry, Margaret said, the words feeling pathetically inadequate. I'm so, so sorry. Sorry doesn't fix this, Sarah said. She walked to the bed and sat down heavily, her face in her hands. I'm filing for divorce. The papers are already being drawn up. I can't be associated with him anymore. My reputation, my career, everything is at risk just because I was married to him. Margaret wanted to defend her son, wanted to argue that marriage meant standing by someone in their darkest hour, but she couldn't find the words, because part of her, the part that was horrified and disappointed and heartbroken beyond measure, understood Sarah's position. Where is he? Margaret asked quietly. Which facility? Sarah looked up, her eyes hard. The Federal Detention Center downtown, but they're not allowing visitors yet. He's in processing or whatever they call it. His arraignment is in 2 days. I'm staying, Margaret said, her voice firmer than she felt. I'm staying in Denver until I can see him. Do whatever you want, Sarah said, turning away. Just don't stay here. I want you gone. I want everything that reminds me of him gone. Margaret stood there for a moment longer looking at this woman she'd thought was her daughter, watching her pack away her son's life into cardboard boxes like he was already dead. Then she turned and walked out of the room, down the stairs, and picked up her suitcase from where she'd left it in the entryway. She walked out of that beautiful house into the cold Denver afternoon, and only when she was on the sidewalk did she allow herself to truly break down. She stood there, a mother who had crossed the country to surprise her son with love and cookies, and sobbed. Margaret found a small motel, about 20 minutes away from Daniel's house, a plain budget place with thin walls and a bed that sagged in the middle. It was all she could afford. Her savings were meager, her nurse's pension barely enough to cover her own bills back home, let alone an extended stay in an expensive city like Denver. But she couldn't leave. Not now. Not when Daniel needed her most. She sat on the edge of that saggy bed in the dim room, her suitcase still unpacked beside her, and tried to make sense of what she'd learned. Daniel, her Daniel, arrested for fraud and embezzlement, facing 15 years in their federal prison. It didn't seem real. It couldn't be real, but it was. She pulled out her phone with trembling hands and searched for information about the federal detention center. Visiting hours were limited, and as Sarah had said, new inmates weren't eligible for visits immediately. Margaret would have to wait. She found information about the arraignment, public record, scheduled for 2 days from now at the federal courthouse. She would be there. No matter what, she would be there. That night, Margaret didn't sleep. She lay in the dark, staring at the water-stained ceiling, replaying every conversation she'd ever had with Daniel, looking for signs she'd missed. Had he seemed stressed during their video calls? Had he seemed different? She tried to remember, but all she could recall was his smile, his assurances that everything was fine, that work was good, that he and Sarah were happy. Had it all been lies? In the morning, exhausted and hollow, Margaret made a decision. She needed to understand what had happened. She needed to know the truth, not just the accusations, but the real story. She needed to know who her son had become. She spent the day trying to find information. She called the detention center, but they would tell her nothing except that Daniel was there and that he would have his arraignment as scheduled. She tried to find a lawyer, but the public defender's office informed her that Daniel already had representation, a court-appointed attorney named Marcus Reynolds. She got the number and called, but the lawyer was in court and couldn't speak to her. She left a message. By evening, she still hadn't heard back. Margaret sat in a small diner near her motel, picking at a plate of meatloaf she couldn't taste when her phone finally rang. Unknown number. Hello, she answered, her heart leaping into her throat. Is this Margaret Chen? A male voice asked. Yes, this is she. Mrs. Chen, this is Marcus Reynolds. I'm representing your son, Daniel. I got your message. Thank you for calling me back, Margaret said, her hand gripping the phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. Please, can you tell me what's happening? Is my son all right? There was a pause, and Margaret could hear papers rustling in the background. Mrs. Chen, I can't discuss the specifics of the case with you without Daniel's permission, but I can tell you that he's physically safe. He's in a cell by himself for now, and he's cooperating with the authorities. What does that mean, cooperating? It means he's talking to them. He's already given a statement, a full confession, actually. Margaret's stomach dropped. But why? Why would he confess if he didn't do it? Maybe they coerced him, maybe. Mrs. Chen, the lawyer said gently, I understand this is difficult, but I need you to understand something. Daniel did do it. The evidence against him is overwhelming. Video surveillance, digital footprints, financial records, witness testimony from his coworkers. There's no question about his guilt. The only question now is mitigation. Mitigation? Margaret repeated numbly. We're going to try to negotiate a plea deal. If Daniel cooperates fully, if he returns what money he hasn't already spent and provides testimony about how he accessed the systems, the prosecution might be willing to recommend a reduced sentence. Instead of 15 years, maybe 8 to 10. 8 to 10 years, her son would be in prison until he was in his mid-40s. By the time he got out, his life would be over. I don't understand, Margaret said, her voice breaking. Why did he do this? We didn't raise him this way. He was a good boy. He was honest and kind, and Mrs. Chen, I don't have those answers. You'll have to ask Daniel yourself when you see him. But I will tell you this, and I'm speaking from experience. Good people sometimes do bad things. It doesn't make the things less bad, but it also doesn't mean the person is fundamentally evil. People make mistakes, terrible mistakes, for all kinds of reasons. When can I see him? Margaret asked. The arraignment is the day after tomorrow at 10 a.m. You can attend as a member of the public. After that, he'll be eligible for visits. I'll make sure your name is on the approved list. Thank you, Margaret whispered. Mr. Reynolds, will you tell him something for me? Will you tell him that his mother loves him? That no matter what, I love him? I will, the lawyer said, his voice kind. I'll tell him. The call ended, and Margaret sat in that diner booth, her cold meatloaf congealing in front of her, and cried again. The other patrons stared, but she didn't care. Her son was going to prison. Her beautiful boy, her whole world, was going to spend the best years of his life behind bars. And she still didn't know why. The day of the arraignment, Margaret woke at 5 in the morning, her body stiff from another sleepless night. She dressed carefully in the nicest clothes she'd brought, a simple gray dress and a cardigan, wanting to look presentable, wanting Daniel to see that she was there for him, that she hadn't abandoned him. The courthouse was an imposing building downtown, all concrete and glass and security checkpoints. Margaret had to go through a metal detector, had to empty her purse, had to be patted down by a stern-faced female security officer. She felt like a criminal herself. The courtroom was smaller than she'd expected, with wooden benches and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look sickly and pale. Margaret took a seat in the back, her hands folded in her lap, and waited. She wasn't alone. There were a handful of other people scattered throughout the room, probably families of other defendants, and a few people who looked like reporters, their notebooks ready, their expressions neutral and professional. At exactly 10 o'clock, a door at the side of the room opened, and Daniel was led in. Margaret's hands flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. He was wearing an orange jumpsuit, his hands cuffed in front of him, his ankles shackled. His hair, usually neat and styled, was disheveled. He'd lost weight, his face gaunt and shadowed. But what broke Margaret's heart more than anything was the look in his eyes. Empty, defeated, dead. He scanned the courtroom briefly, and his gaze landed on her. For a moment, just a moment, something flickered in his expression. Pain? Shame? Love? Margaret couldn't tell. Then he looked away, his jaw tightening, and allowed himself to be led to the defense table, where Marcus Reynolds, a middle-aged man in a slightly rumpled suit, was waiting. The arraignment itself was quick and procedural. The charges were read aloud, a litany of crimes that made Margaret feel sicker with each word. Wire fraud, computer fraud, theft of trade secrets, money laundering. Daniel stood silently as the judge asked if he understood the charges. "Yes, Your Honor," he said, his voice barely audible. "How do you plead?" "Guilty, Your Honor." The word echoed through the courtroom. Guilty, no trial, no chance to fight, just guilty. The judge set a date for sentencing, scheduled for 6 weeks out, and remanded Daniel back into custody. The whole thing took less than 15 minutes. As the bailiff led Daniel away, he glanced back one more time. His eyes met Margaret's, and this time she could read what she saw there. "I'm sorry, Mom." Then he was gone, led back through the side door, and Margaret was left sitting in that courtroom, her heart shattered into pieces. She wanted to run after him, to hold him, to tell him everything would be all right. But she couldn't move. She just sat there as the courtroom emptied, as the reporters filed out to write their stories, as the next case was called. Finally, a bailiff approached her gently. "Ma'am, you need to leave. We have other proceedings." Margaret nodded mutely and stood on shaking legs. She walked out of that courthouse into the bright Denver sunlight, and the world looked exactly the same as it had when she'd walked in, but everything had changed. Everything. Over the next few days, Margaret established a routine. She stayed in her dingy motel room, eating cheap takeout, spending her days researching federal prison systems, and trying to understand the legal process. She called Daniel's lawyer daily, asking questions, trying to prepare herself for what was coming. Marcus Reynolds was patient with her, more patient than he probably needed to be. He explained the plea agreement they were negotiating. In exchange for Daniel's full cooperation and testimony about the security vulnerabilities he'd exploited, the prosecution was willing to recommend a sentence of 9 years instead of 15. 9 years. It still felt like a lifetime. Margaret finally got approved to visit Daniel 5 days after the arraignment. The Federal Detention Center was a gray, foreboding building that looked more like a fortress than a place where human beings lived. She had to go, through extensive security, had to be searched again, had to have her ID verified multiple times. She was allowed to bring nothing with her except her driver's license, No purse, no phone, nothing. The visiting room was a large space divided by thick glass partitions. On one side were chairs for visitors. On the other side, chairs for inmates. They would communicate through phones, unable to touch, unable to embrace. Margaret sat in her assigned chair, her hands trembling, and waited. When Daniel was led in on the other side of the glass, wearing his orange jumpsuit, his hands cuffed, Margaret's heart broke all over again. He looked even worse than he had at the arraignment. There were dark circles under his eyes. His skin was pale, and he moved like an old man, shuffled and defeated. He sat down across from her and picked up the phone on his side. Margaret grabbed hers. "Danny," she said, her voice cracking. "Oh, Danny." "Hi, Mom," he said quietly, not meeting her eyes. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry you have to see me like this." "I don't care about that," Margaret said, tears streaming down her face. "I just care about you. Are you all right? Are they treating you okay?" "I'm fine," he said, which was so obviously a lie that Margaret wanted to scream. "You shouldn't have come to Denver. You shouldn't be wasting your money on this." "You're my son," Margaret said fiercely. "Where else would I be? Daniel, please, I need you to tell me what happened. I need to understand why." Daniel was silent for a long moment, staring at his cuffed hands. When he finally looked up, his eyes were filled with tears. "I messed up, Mom. I messed up so bad." "But why?" Margaret pressed. "You had a good job, a good life. What made you do this?" "It started small," Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just moved some money around just a little to cover a bet I'd made. I thought I'd pay it back before anyone noticed." "A bet?" Margaret repeated. "You were gambling?" Daniel nodded miserably. "Online poker. I got into it about 2 years ago. At first it was just for fun, small amounts. But then I started winning, and it felt incredible, the rush, you know. And then I started losing. Big. I lost $20,000 in one night." Margaret gasped. 20,000. I panicked. I didn't know what to do. Sarah didn't know about the gambling. I'd been hiding it from her using a separate bank account, and I knew if she found out, she'd be furious. So I thought, I'll just borrow from the company accounts, just for a few days, just until I can win it back. "Oh, Daniel," Margaret whispered. "I know," he said, his face crumpling. "I know how stupid that sounds, but I wasn't thinking clearly. I was in this spiral, and I couldn't see a way out. So I took the money, and I did win some back. Not all of it, but some. And it was so easy, Mom. The company's security systems, I knew them inside and out. I'd helped design them. I knew exactly where the blind spots were." "So you took more," Margaret said, not a question but a statement. "I took more," Daniel confirmed. "Every time I lost, I'd take more to try to win it back. And then I started taking extra just to have a cushion, just in case. And then," he stopped, swallowing hard. "And then it wasn't even about the gambling anymore. It was about the money itself, about having it, about feeling powerful." "What about Sarah?" Margaret asked. "Didn't she notice? Didn't she wonder where the money was going?" "Sarah thought I was getting bonuses, that my investments were paying off. I showed her fake statements, fake tax returns. I lied to her about everything." He looked up at Margaret, his eyes red and raw. "I lied to everyone, Mom. To Sarah, to my bosses, to my coworkers, to you. Every time we talked and you asked if I was okay, if everything was fine, I lied." "I would have helped you," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "If you told me you were in trouble, I would have found a way to help. We could have figured it out together." "I know," Daniel said, "but I was ashamed. I was so ashamed. And I kept thinking I could fix it myself, that I could win enough to pay it all back and no one would ever know, but I couldn't. The losses just kept piling up, and I kept taking more, and it spiraled completely out of control." "How much did you lose gambling?" Margaret asked. "All of it." "Most of it," Daniel said. "About 1.5 million. The rest I spent on stupid things. Expensive watches, trips, trying to keep up appearances, trying to look like the successful guy everyone thought I was." Margaret shook her head, trying to process it all. Her son, her careful, intelligent son, had thrown his life away on gambling and ego. "The FBI," she said. How did they find out? One of my coworkers noticed discrepancies in the accounts. He reported it to the compliance department, and they started an investigation. Once they started looking, it wasn't hard to trace everything back to me. I wasn't as clever as I thought I was. And you confessed? What else could I do? Daniel said, his voice hollow. The evidence was overwhelming. My lawyer said if I fought it, if I went to trial and lost, I'd get the maximum sentence, maybe 20 years. But if I cooperated, if I pled guilty and helped them understand how I did it so they could fix the security holes, I might get less time. 9 years, Margaret said. Your lawyer told me 9 years. 9 years if the judge accepts the plea deal, Daniel corrected. He doesn't have to. He could give me more. The thought made Margaret feel sick. Sarah is divorcing you, she said quietly. I know, Daniel said. I don't blame her. I destroyed her life too. She's probably going to lose her job because of me, because of the scandal. Everyone's going to assume she knew that she was in on it. She's packing up your things. She wants you out of the house. That's her right, Daniel said. It's her house. Her parents bought it. I just lived there. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of everything that had been lost hanging between them. Mom, Daniel finally said, I need you to do something for me. Anything, Margaret said immediately. I need you to go home, back to Sacramento. You can't afford to stay here, and I don't want you wasting your money on me. I made this mess. I have to deal with the consequences. I'm not leaving you, Margaret said firmly. I'm your mother. I'm staying until your sentencing, and then I'll visit you wherever they send you. Mom, please. No, Margaret interrupted. No, Daniel, you made terrible mistakes. You did terrible things. But you're still my son, and I will not abandon you. Do you understand me? I will not leave you alone in this. Daniel's face crumpled, and he pressed his hand against the glass. Margaret pressed hers against it from her side, wishing desperately that she could feel his warmth, could hold him like she had when he was small and scared. I'm so sorry, Mom, he sobbed. I'm so, so sorry. I know, baby, Margaret said, crying too. I know. A guard appeared behind Daniel, tapping his shoulder. Time was up. I love you, Margaret said quickly. No matter what, I love you. I love you too, Mom, Daniel said. Then he was being led away, and Margaret was left alone in that cold visiting room, her hand still pressed against the glass where his had been. The next 6 weeks were the longest of Margaret's life. She stayed in Denver, despite Daniel's protests, moving to an even cheaper motel when her money started running dangerously low. She visited Daniel twice a week, the maximum allowed, and each visit broke her heart a little more. She watched her son deteriorate behind that glass, watched the hope drain from his eyes as the sentencing date approached. She tried to reach out to Sarah, called and texted, hoping to build some kind of bridge, but Sarah never responded. The one time Margaret went back to the house, she found it empty. Sarah had moved out, leaving no forwarding address. The house was listed for sale. Marcus Reynolds kept her updated on the legal proceedings. The plea deal was finalized. In exchange for Daniel's guilty plea and cooperation, the prosecution would recommend 9 years. But as the lawyer had warned, the judge wasn't bound by that recommendation. He could impose any sentence up to the maximum. Judges tend to follow the recommendations, Marcus told her. But in white-collar crimes like this, especially ones involving breach of trust, sometimes they want to make an example. What does that mean? Margaret asked, though she was afraid she already knew. It means he could get more than 9 years, 10, 12, maybe even 15 if the judge feels strongly about it. Margaret felt like she was living in a nightmare from which she couldn't wake up. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in late November. Margaret woke that day, before dawn, too anxious to sleep. She dressed in the same gray dress and cardigan she'd worn to the arraignment, now wrinkled despite her best efforts to keep them nice. She couldn't afford dry cleaning. She took a bus to the courthouse, unable to afford another taxi, and arrived an hour early, wanting to make sure she got a seat, wanting to be there when Daniel was brought in. The courtroom slowly filled. She recognized Marcus Reynolds, looking tired and carrying a battered briefcase. There were a few reporters again, fewer than at the arraignment. White-collar crime wasn't as sexy as other types, apparently. And then, shockingly, Sarah walked in. She looked different, thinner, harder, dressed in a severe black suit. She didn't look in Margaret's direction, just took a seat on the opposite side of the courtroom and stared straight ahead. Margaret's heart ached. She wanted to go to her, to talk to her, but something in Sarah's posture warned her off. This wasn't the time. At exactly 9 o'clock, Daniel was brought in. He looked terrible, worse than Margaret had ever seen him. Prison, even the relatively short time he'd spent there, had changed him. He looked older, defeated, broken. He was led to the defense table and sat next to Marcus Reynolds. He glanced back at Margaret, gave her a small, sad smile, and then looked at Sarah. Sarah didn't look back. Daniel's face fell, and he turned around, his shoulders slumping even further. The judge entered, an older man with gray hair and a stern expression. Everyone stood, then sat. The hearing began. The prosecutor, a sharp-looking woman in her 30s, stood and outlined Daniel's crimes methodically and dispassionately. She detailed the amount stolen, $2.1 million in total, the methods used, and the breach of trust involved. She noted that Daniel had cooperated fully and had shown remorse. Per the plea agreement, she recommended a sentence of 9 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release and full restitution of the stolen funds. Marcus Reynolds then stood to speak on Daniel's behalf. He talked about Daniel's lack of prior criminal record, his gambling addiction that had spiraled out of control, his genuine remorse, and his cooperation with authorities. He noted that Daniel had helped the company identify and fix security vulnerabilities that could have been exploited by others. He asked the judge to accept the prosecution's recommendation of 9 years. Then the judge spoke. "Does the defendant wish to make a statement?" Margaret held her breath. Daniel stood slowly, his hands still cuffed in front of him. "Your Honor," he said, his voice shaking but clear, "I want to start by apologizing. To the company I worked for, to the colleagues I betrayed, to the shareholders who lost money because of my actions. I stole from them and I lied to them, and there's no excuse for what I did." He paused, swallowing hard. "I also want to apologize to my wife, my soon-to-be ex-wife, Sarah. She didn't know anything about what I was doing. She's completely innocent, and I destroyed her life along with mine. I'm sorry, Sarah. You deserved so much better than me." Sarah didn't move, didn't react at all. Daniel's voice broke. "And I want to apologize to my mother. She raised me better than this. She worked her whole life to give me opportunities, to make sure I had a good education and a good start in life, and I threw it all away. I'm so sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry I let you down." Margaret was crying silently, tears streaming down her face. "I have a gambling addiction," Daniel continued. "That's not an excuse, just a fact. I've started attending Gamblers Anonymous meetings in the detention center, and I plan to continue that in prison. I want to get better. I want to understand why I did what I did so that I never do anything like it again." He took a shaky breath. "I know I deserve to be punished. I know I have to pay for what I did. I just hope that someday, after I've served my time and paid my restitution, I'll be able to rebuild some small part of my life. Thank you, Your Honor." Daniel sat down, and the courtroom was silent. The judge looked down at his notes for a long moment. Then he looked up at Daniel. "Mr. Chen," he said, his voice stern but not unkind, "I've reviewed all the materials in this case. I've read your presentence report, the victim impact statements, the letters submitted on your behalf, and the prosecution's recommendation." Margaret had written one of those letters, pouring her heart onto the page, begging the judge for mercy. "You committed serious crimes," the judge continued. "You stole a substantial amount of money, you breached the trust of your employer, and you engaged in sophisticated fraud over an extended period of time. These are not minor offenses." Daniel nodded, his head bowed. "However," the judge said, and Margaret's heart leaped, "I also note that you have no prior criminal history. You cooperated fully with authorities. You've taken responsibility for your actions, and you appear to have genuine remorse." The judge paused, and the silence in the courtroom was deafening. "I am going to accept the prosecution's recommendation. You are hereby sentenced to 9 years in federal prison, to be followed by 3 years of supervised release. You are also ordered to pay full restitution in the amount of $2.1 million. Court is adjourned." The gavel fell. 9 years. Not more, but not less. Daniel would be 41 years old when he got out. Margaret didn't know whether to feel relieved or devastated. 9 years of her son's life gone. 9 years where she would only see him through glass, where they would only speak through phones. As the bailiff approached Daniel to lead him away, Daniel looked back at Margaret one more time. "I love you, Mom," he mouthed. "I love you too, baby," Margaret said, though she knew he couldn't hear her through the glass. And then he was gone, led back to his cell, and Margaret sat in that courtroom feeling completely, utterly alone. She stood on shaken legs and made her way toward the exit. At the door, she found Sarah standing there as if waiting. The two women looked at each other. "Sarah," Margaret said softly, "I know you probably don't want to talk to me, but I just want you to know that I understand. I understand why you're divorcing him. He hurt you terribly, and you don't owe him anything." Sarah's jaw was tight, her eyes dry but red-rimmed. "He destroyed everything," she said quietly. "My reputation, my career, my life. People look at me differently now. They think I knew. They think I helped him." "I'm sorry," Margaret said. "For whatever it's worth, I believe you. I know you didn't know. Daniel told me you didn't." "That doesn't help me," Sarah said bitterly. Then her expression softened just slightly. "But thank you for saying it." They stood in awkward silence for a moment. "What will you do now?" Sarah asked. "I'm going home," Margaret said. "Back to Sacramento. I'll come back to visit Daniel when I can afford it, whenever they transfer him to his permanent facility." "And I'm moving back to Boston," Sarah said. "Back to my parents, starting over." "I hope you find happiness," Margaret said sincerely. "I hope you find someone who deserves you." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, the first emotion Margaret had seen from her. "I hope your son finds a way to live with what he's done," she said. Then she turned and walked away, her heels clicking on the marble floor, and Margaret watched her go, knowing she'd probably never see her daughter-in-law again. Margaret flew back to Sacramento the next day, her savings nearly depleted, her heart heavy. She returned to her small apartment, to her quiet life, to her shifts at the hospital. But everything had changed. She was now the mother of a convicted felon. People at work looked at her differently when they found out. Some were kind, offering sympathy and support. Others were judgmental, their eyes saying what their mouths wouldn't. "You must have done something wrong, must have failed as a mother." Margaret tried not to care what they thought, but it hurt. It all hurt. Daniel was transferred to a federal prison in California 3 months after his sentencing, a mercy that allowed Margaret to visit more easily. She went once a month, the maximum she could afford on her budget, driving 3 hours each way to sit across from him in a noisy visiting room, surrounded by other families going through their own tragedies. She watched her son slowly adjust to prison life. He got a job in the prison library. He continued attending Gamblers Anonymous. He took classes working toward a degree in a field he'd once excelled in, but had betrayed. He wrote her letters, long letters full of regret and slowly growing acceptance. He told her about the other inmates, some kind, some dangerous, all broken in their own ways. He told her about the monotony of prison, the way days blurred together, the constant noise, the lack of privacy, the loss of dignity. He apologized in every letter, over and over, until Margaret finally wrote back and told him to stop. She didn't need more apologies. She just needed him to survive and to come out on the other side a better man. The years crawled by. Margaret turned 65, then 67, then 70. She retired from nursing, her body too tired to continue the demanding work. Her pension was small, but she managed cutting expenses where she could, always saving enough to visit Daniel, to put money in his commissary account so he could buy small comforts. She watched her son age behind bars, watched lines appear on his face, watched his hair start to gray. She watched him miss everything: weddings of friends, the births of their children, holidays, birthdays, the simple freedom of walking outside whenever he wanted. And she wondered, late at night, in her small apartment, if she had failed him somehow, if there had been signs she'd missed when he was younger, if she'd been too easy on him or too hard, if she'd taught him the wrong lessons about money or success or self-worth. She tortured herself with these questions, never finding satisfactory answers. Sarah did move back to Boston. Margaret knew because she'd looked her up on social media once, a moment of weakness. Sarah had changed her name back to her maiden name. She'd gotten a new job in marketing. And eventually, Margaret saw she'd gotten remarried to someone who looked kind in the photos, someone who made her smile. Margaret was glad for her. Sarah deserved happiness. Daniel had taken enough from her. As Daniel's 7th year in prison began, Margaret started to feel her age more acutely. She had some health problems, nothing serious yet, but warning signs. High blood pressure, arthritis that made the long drive to the prison painful. She didn't tell Daniel. She didn't want to worry him. He had enough to deal with. And then in Daniel's 8th year, something unexpected happened. Margaret received a letter from Marcus Reynolds, Daniel's lawyer. She opened it with trembling hands, fearing bad news. But it wasn't bad news, it was incredible news. Daniel was being considered for early release due to his exemplary behavior, his participation in rehabilitation programs, and prison overcrowding. He was eligible to have his sentence reduced. With good time credits, he could potentially be released in 6 months instead of serving his full 9 years. Margaret read the letter 3 times, unable to believe it. 6 months. Her son could be home in 6 months. She called the number at the bottom of the letter immediately, and Marcus Reynolds confirmed it. It's not guaranteed, he warned. The parole board has to approve it, and there's a hearing where they'll evaluate whether Daniel is a good candidate for early release. But his record in prison has been perfect. He's done everything right. I think he has a good chance. Margaret hung up the phone and cried, but this time they were tears of hope, the first she'd shed in 8 long years. She wrote to Daniel immediately, a short note because her hands were shaking too much to write more. She told him she was proud of him, that she believed in him, that 6 more months was nothing compared to what they'd already endured. Daniel's response came a week later. Mom, he wrote, I don't want to get my hopes up. I've learned in here that hope is dangerous, that it's safer to just accept where you are and not dream of anything better. But I can't help it. The thought of being free, of being able to hug you instead of just seeing you through glass, it's keeping me going. I don't know if I deserve early release, but I'm going to fight for it. I'm going to show the parole board that I'm not the same person who came in here. I've changed, Mom. Prison changes everyone, but I've tried to let it change me for the better. I've had a lot of time to think about what I did, about why I did it, and about the person I want to be when I get out. I'll never be able to undo the harm I caused, but maybe I can spend the rest of my life trying to do some good, trying to balance the scales just a little. The hearing was scheduled for 3 months away. Margaret marked the date on her calendar and counted down the days like a child waiting for her birthday. She prepared for it obsessively, writing another letter to the parole board, calling Marcus Reynolds weekly for updates, praying to a God she wasn't sure she believed in, but was willing to try anything. She even reached out to Sarah, sending an email through a mutual acquaintance, asking if Sarah would be willing to write a letter supporting Daniel's early release. She didn't expect a response, and she didn't get one. She understood. Sarah had moved on, and that was her right. The day of the parole hearing arrived. Margaret drove to the prison, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were white. She was allowed to attend, to speak if she chose, to advocate for her son. The hearing room was small and institutional, with a long table where 3 parole board members sat, 2 men and a woman, all looking tired and skeptical. Daniel was brought in wearing his prison uniform, his hands cuffed. He looked nervous but composed. The hearing began with the board reviewing Daniel's record. They noted his crimes, the severity, the amount of money involved. They noted his cooperation with authorities, his guilty plea, his completion of various rehabilitation programs. They noted that he'd had no disciplinary infractions during his incarceration, that he'd worked consistently, that he'd earned his degree. Then they asked him questions. Mr. Chen, the woman on the board, said, "Why do you think you deserve early release?" Daniel took a breath. "I don't know if I deserve it, ma'am. I did terrible things and I hurt a lot of people, but I do think I'm ready to re-enter society. I've spent the last 8 years taking responsibility for my actions, working on understanding why I made the choices I did and trying to become a better person." "You stole over $2 million, one of the men said. "How do you expect to pay that back?" "The restitution order is still in effect." "I know," Daniel said. "I'm fully aware that I owe that money, and I intend to pay every penny back, even if it takes the rest of my life." I've been working with a financial counselor here, and I have a plan. I'll get a job when I'm released, whatever job I can get with my record. I know it won't be in tech, not with a fraud conviction, but I'll work, and every paycheck, a portion, will go to restitution. I've already paid back about 20,000 from the job I've had here. Margaret hadn't known that. 20,000 wasn't much against 2.1 million, but it was something. It showed commitment. What about your gambling addiction? The other man asked. How do we know you won't relapse? I've been attending Gamblers Anonymous meetings every week for the last 8 years, Daniel said. I've worked the 12 steps. I've been honest about my addiction and the harm it caused. I know I'll always be an addict, that it's something I'll have to manage for the rest of my life. But I have tools now, coping mechanisms, support systems, and I'll continue attending meetings on the outside. What are your plans if you're released? The woman asked. Where will you live? How will you support yourself? I'll live with my mother, Daniel said, glancing back at Margaret. She's offered me a place to stay until I can get on my feet. As for work, I've been in contact with a job placement program for ex-offenders. They've connected me with several employers who are willing to hire people with records. The jobs aren't glamorous, warehouse work, food service, but they're honest work, and I am willing to do them. The board members made notes, asked a few more questions, and then turned to Margaret. Mrs. Chen, you've submitted a letter in support of your son's early release. Would you like to add anything? Margaret stood on shaking legs. Yes, thank you. I know my son committed serious crimes. I'm not here to excuse what he did or to minimize the harm he caused. But I'm here to tell you that he's not that person anymore. I've visited him every month for 8 years, and I've watched him change. I've watched him grow and accept responsibility and work to become better. Her voice shook, but she continued. Daniel made terrible mistakes, but he was a good person before those mistakes, and I believe he's a good person again now. He was lost, caught in an addiction he didn't understand, making choice after choice that led him down a dark path. But he's found his way back, and if you give him this chance, I promise you he won't waste it. I'll make sure of it. He'll have a safe place to live, support, accountability. Please give my son a chance to prove he can be a contributing member of society again. Margaret sat down, her heart pounding. The board members conferred quietly among themselves for a few minutes. Then the woman spoke. Thank you, Mrs. Chen. Mr. Chen, we'll review all the information and issue our decision within 2 weeks. You'll be notified by mail. Daniel nodded. Thank you for considering my case. He was led away, and Margaret was left sitting in that hearing room, praying that she'd said enough, that the board had seen what she saw, that they'd give her son this chance. The 2 weeks that followed were agony. Margaret jumped every time the mail came, her heart racing, only to be disappointed day after day. She couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, could barely function. And then, 14 days after the hearing, the letter came. Margaret's hands shook so badly she could barely open the envelope. She unfolded the single page and read, Mr. Daniel Chen, after careful consideration of your case, including your institutional record, your participation in rehabilitation programs, and your plans for reentry into society, the parole board has decided to grant your petition for early release. You will be released on December 15th, contingent upon having an approved residence and employment plan. The conditions of your supervised release remain in effect. Margaret's legs gave out, and she sat down hard on her living room floor, the letter clutched to her chest. He was coming home. Her son was coming home. She called Marcus Reynolds immediately, sobbing so hard she could barely speak. He's coming home. They approved it. He's coming home. I know, Marcus said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. I got the notification too. Congratulations, Mrs. Chen. Daniel did it. Margaret called the prison, desperate to speak to Daniel, to share the news, but she was told he'd already been informed. She would have to wait until her next visit to see him, to celebrate with him. That visit, 2 weeks later, was the happiest Margaret had been in 8 years. Daniel was brought into the visiting room with a smile on his face, a real smile, the first she'd seen in so long. They couldn't hug, not yet, but they pressed their hands against the glass and cried together, tears of joy this time. 4 more weeks, Mom, Daniel said, his voice breaking. 4 more weeks and I'll be free. 4 more weeks, Margaret repeated. And then you're coming home, and we're going to build a new life, a good life. I'm scared, Daniel admitted. I don't know how to live in the world anymore. I don't know if I remember how. We'll figure it out together, Margaret said firmly. One day at a time. That's all we have to do, one day at a time. The day Daniel was released, December 15th, was cold and clear. Margaret woke before dawn, too excited to sleep. She dressed carefully, packing a bag with clothes for Daniel, regular clothes, jeans and a sweater, and a warm jacket, things that would fit the man he'd become rather than the boy he'd been. She drove to the prison, arriving 2 hours before his scheduled release time, too nervous to be late. She waited in the parking lot, watching the sun rise over the concrete walls, watching other families arrive for visits, watching the world wake up. At exactly 9 a.m., the release door, a different door than the one visitors used, opened, and Daniel walked out. He was wearing the clothes she'd sent, carrying a small bag with his few possessions. He looked thin and tired and older than his 41 years, but he was free. He stood there on the sidewalk for a moment, breathing in the cold air, looking up at the sky, a man who hadn't stood outside without walls around him in 8 years. Then he saw Margaret. She was out of her car in an instant, running toward him despite her arthritis, despite her age. And Daniel ran too. They met in the middle of the parking lot, and Margaret threw her arms around her son, holding him tight, feeling his solid warmth, his beating heart, his living presence. I'm home, Mom, Daniel said into her hair. I'm finally home. Yes, baby, Margaret said, crying and laughing at the same time. Yes, you are. You're home. They stood there holding each other for a long time, not caring who saw, not caring about anything, except that they were together, that the nightmare was finally over. Eventually, they pulled apart. Daniel wiped his eyes. I don't deserve you, Mom. After everything I put you through. Stop, Margaret said firmly. We're not doing that anymore. No more apologies. We're looking forward now, not back. Okay? Daniel nodded, a small smile on his face. Okay. They got into Margaret's car, Daniel pausing before he got in, marveling at the simple act of opening a car door, of choosing to get in, of having that freedom. The drive back to Margaret's apartment took 3 hours. They talked the whole way, Daniel asking about everything, news, politics, technology, all the things he'd missed. Margaret filled him in, watching him marvel at how much the world had changed in 8 years. When they arrived at the apartment, Margaret had prepared a welcome home meal. Nothing fancy, just simple home-cooked food, the dishes Daniel had loved as a child. They ate together at Margaret's small kitchen table, and it felt like a miracle. What happens now? Daniel asked after dinner. Now, Margaret said, you rest. Tomorrow you start your job. I've arranged everything with the placement program. It's at a warehouse, just like you said. Not glamorous, but honest work. And then? And then you keep going, day by day. You work, you attend your meetings, you check in with your parole officer, you rebuild your life, piece by piece. What if I can't do it? Daniel asked quietly. What if I mess up again? You won't, Margaret said, because you're not alone this time. You have me, and you have the tools you learned in prison, and you have a second chance. Not everyone gets that. Don't waste it. Daniel nodded, his eyes filling with tears again. I won't, Mom. I promise you, I won't. That night, Daniel slept in the small guest room Margaret had prepared for him. It was cramped and plain, nothing like the house he'd once lived in, but it was safe and warm and free. Margaret lay in her own bed, staring at the ceiling, hardly daring to believe her son was under her roof, that they'd made it through the darkness to this other side. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. Daniel would struggle to find his place in the world again. The stigma of his conviction would follow him. The debt he owed, both financial and moral, was enormous. But they would face it together. Mother and son, just like it had been after his father died, just like it had been all along. In the morning, Margaret woke to the smell of coffee. She went into the kitchen and found Daniel standing at the stove making breakfast. He turned and smiled at her. Good morning, Mom. Good morning, Danny, she said, and her heart felt full. They sat together and ate, talking about his first day of work, his nervousness, and his determination. After breakfast, Daniel got dressed in the simple work clothes Margaret had bought for him. He looked at himself in the mirror, barely recognizing the man staring back. "You ready?" Margaret asked. "As ready as I'll ever be," Daniel said. She drove him to the warehouse, waited while he went in for his orientation. When he came out 4 hours later, he was exhausted but proud. "I start tomorrow," he said. "They're giving me a chance." "Of course they are," Margaret said. "Everyone deserves a second chance." Over the following weeks and months, Daniel settled into his new life. The work at the warehouse was physically demanding, nothing like the mental challenges of his old job, but he threw himself into it. He attended his Gamblers Anonymous meetings religiously. He checked in with his parole officer every week, passing every drug test, following every rule. He started paying restitution from his paychecks, small amounts that barely made a dent in the massive debt. But it was a start. Margaret watched her son slowly come back to life. She saw the guilt and shame he carried, saw how he flinched when people asked about his past, saw how hard he worked to prove he'd changed. But she also saw moments of peace, moments where he smiled genuinely, where he laughed, where he seemed to remember that he was more than his worst mistakes. One evening, about 6 months after his release, Daniel came home from work looking thoughtful. They sat together for dinner, and he was quiet. "What's on your mind?" Margaret finally asked. "I've been thinking," Daniel said slowly, "about what I can do with my life now. I can't be a software engineer again. No one will hire me with my record, not in that field. But I don't want to just work in a warehouse forever either. I want to do something meaningful." "What did you have in mind?" "I was talking to my sponsor at Gamblers Anonymous," Daniel said. "He suggested I might want to become a peer counselor, work with other people struggling with gambling addiction. I have experience, and I have a story that might help others avoid the mistakes I made." Margaret felt her eyes fill with tears. "I think that's a wonderful idea." "It won't pay much," Daniel warned. "I'll probably need to keep the warehouse job for a while, do the counseling part-time. But it feels right, like maybe I can take this terrible thing I did and use it to help people." "That's exactly what you should do," Margaret said firmly. "Turn your pain into purpose." Daniel started training to become a peer counselor. It was slow going, fitting the classes around his work schedule and parole requirements, but he was determined. Margaret watched him find a sense of meaning again, watched him connect with other people struggling with addiction, watched him share his story, ugly as it was, in hopes of keeping others from going down the same path. 2 years after his release, Daniel met someone. Her name was Lisa, a woman who worked at the community center where Daniel volunteered. She knew about his past. He'd been honest from the beginning, but she saw past it. She saw the man he was trying to become. Margaret met Lisa for the first time over Sunday dinner at the apartment. Lisa was kind and warm, with laugh lines around her eyes and a gentle manner. She worked as a social worker, helping at-risk youth. She and Daniel had similar views on second chances and redemption. "Thank you," Margaret said to Lisa as they washed dishes together while Daniel took out the trash. "For what?" Lisa asked, surprised. "For seeing my son, the real him, not just his mistakes." Lisa smiled. "Daniel is a good man, Mrs. Chen. He made bad choices, but he's done the work to change. That takes courage." Margaret wiped her eyes, pretending it was from dish soap. 3 years after his release, Daniel and Lisa got married in a simple ceremony at a small park. There were no fancy decorations, no expensive photographer, just a handful of close friends, Daniel's parole officer, his sponsor from Gamblers Anonymous, and Margaret. Daniel wore a suit from a thrift store. Lisa wore a simple white dress. And when they said their vows, promising to stand by each other through whatever came, Margaret cried. This time her tears were purely happy. Daniel had found love again, despite everything. He had found someone who believed in him. After the ceremony, Daniel pulled Margaret aside. "Mom, I need to tell you something." "What is it?" Margaret asked, suddenly worried. "I've been paying restitution for 4 years now. I still owe almost $2 million. At the rate I'm going, it'll take me 40 more years to pay it all back." "I know, honey," Margaret said. "It's okay. You're doing your best." "That's not what I wanted to tell you," Daniel said. "What I wanted to say is that I'm okay with that. I'm okay with the fact that I'll probably be paying this debt for the rest of my life because it reminds me every single day of what I did, of the harm I caused. It keeps me honest. He looked at his new wife, talking and laughing with their small group of guests. I don't have money or a fancy house or a prestigious job, but I have something better. I have people who love me despite knowing the worst things about me. I have meaningful work helping others. I have you, Mom. And now I have Lisa. I'm richer than I ever was when I had millions of dollars that didn't belong to me. Margaret hugged her son tightly. I'm so proud of you, Danny. So very proud. I couldn't have done any of this without you, Daniel said. You never gave up on me, even when you should have, even when everyone else did. You're my son, Margaret said simply. I will never give up on you, never. 5 years after Daniel's release, Margaret was diagnosed with cancer. It was aggressive, the prognosis not good. Daniel took a leave of absence from his jobs to care for her, just as she had once cared for him. He drove her to chemotherapy appointments, held her hand through the worst of it, cooked for her when she was too weak to stand. Lisa helped too, her social work training, giving her the skills to navigate the medical system, to advocate for Margaret's care. Margaret fought hard, but the cancer was winning. On what would turn out to be one of her last days, lying in a hospital bed with Daniel and Lisa sitting beside her, Margaret looked at her son. I need you to know something, she said, her voice weak. What, Mom? Daniel asked, taking her hand. I need you to know that you made me proud, not just before, when you were successful, but now, especially now. The man you've become, the way you've faced your mistakes and worked to make amends, the way you've helped others, that's the greatest achievement of your life. Mom, don't talk like that. You're going to beat this. You're going to. Daniel, Margaret interrupted gently. Listen to me. I need you to hear this. You are a good man. You made terrible mistakes, but you owned them and you changed. That's all anyone can do. That's all any of us can do. She squeezed his hand with what little strength she had left. I'm not disappointed in you. I never was. I was disappointed in what you did, but never in who you are. Do you understand me? Daniel was crying, his tears falling on their clasped hands. I understand, Mom. I love you so much. I love you too, baby, Margaret said. Now promise me something. Anything. Promise me you'll keep going, keep helping people, keep being honest, keep building the life you deserve, and promise me you'll be happy. You deserve happiness, Daniel. After everything, you deserve to be happy. I promise, Mom, Daniel said. I promise. Margaret Chen passed away peacefully 2 days later, surrounded by the son she'd never given up on and the daughter-in-law who had welcomed her into their small family. At her funeral, Daniel spoke. He told the gathered mourners, most of them nurses and hospital staff who had worked with Margaret over the years, about his mother's strength. He spoke honestly about his crimes and his time in prison. He spoke about how his mother had visited him every month for 8 years, had never abandoned him, had believed in him even when he didn't believe in himself. My mother, Daniel said, his voice breaking, showed me what unconditional love looks like. She showed me that it's possible to love someone while still holding them accountable, to support someone while still acknowledging the harm they've caused. She showed me that redemption is possible, not because we deserve it, but because people like her choose to believe in second chances. He looked out at the small crowd. I spent years of my life as a criminal, a liar, and a person who hurt everyone around me. I deserved to be alone. I deserved to be abandoned. But my mother refused to let that be my story's ending. She refused to give up on me, and because she didn't give up, I didn't give up on myself. Daniel wiped his eyes. I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of her love and her faith in me. I will keep helping others, keep working to make amends, keep choosing honesty and integrity even when it's hard. That's the legacy she gave me, and I will honor it. After the funeral, after Margaret was laid to rest in a simple grave that Daniel would visit every week for the rest of his life, he and Lisa went home to the small apartment they'd moved into together. The apartment Margaret had helped them find, had helped furnish with her modest savings. Daniel stood at the window looking out at the city. Are you okay? Lisa asked gently, coming to stand beside him. I am, Daniel said, and he meant it. I'm sad. I'll miss her every day for the rest of my life. But I'm also grateful. Grateful that I got those last 5 years with her. Grateful that I was out of prison, that I got to take care of her the way she took care of me. She was proud of you, Lisa said. I know, Daniel said, and I'm going to make sure she stays proud. I'm going to keep my promises to her. Daniel did keep his promises. In the years that followed Margaret's death, he continued his work as a peer counselor, eventually transitioning to full-time work helping people with gambling addictions. He became a certified addiction counselor, using his own story as a cautionary tale and a message of hope. He and Lisa had a daughter, a little girl they named Margaret, after the grandmother she would never meet. Daniel told his daughter about her grandmother, about the woman who never gave up, who loved unconditionally, who believed in second chances. He was honest with his daughter about his past, age appropriately at first, then more completely as she grew older. He wanted her to know that people make mistakes, sometimes terrible ones, but that those mistakes don't have to define you if you're willing to do the hard work of change. The restitution debt followed him for decades, just as he'd known it would. Every paycheck, a portion went to paying back what he'd stolen. He would be 70 years old before it was fully paid. But he never complained. It was his debt to bear, the consequence of his actions. Daniel thought about his mother every day. When he faced difficult decisions, he asked himself what she would have done. When he felt tempted to take shortcuts or tell small lies, he remembered her unwavering honesty and forced himself to stay on the right path. When he felt like giving up, like the weight of his past was too much to carry, he remembered her sitting across from him in that prison visiting room, pressing her hand against the glass, telling him she loved him, telling him she believed in him. 20 years after his release from prison, Daniel was invited to speak at a conference on addiction and recovery. He stood before hundreds of people and told his story, the whole thing, ugly and honest. He talked about the gambling, the theft, the lies. He talked about his arrest, his confession, his sentencing. He talked about prison, about the years of his life he'd lost. And then he talked about his mother. My mother, Margaret Chen, Daniel said, his voice strong and clear, was a nurse who never made much money. She worked hard her whole life just to get by. She had every reason to turn her back on me when I was arrested. I had embarrassed her, disappointed her, hurt her deeply. And I was going to prison for years. She could have written me off, could have told people she didn't have a son anymore. Many people would have understood if she had. He paused, looking out at the audience. But she didn't. She spent her savings to visit me every month for 8 years. She drove hours to sit across from me in a visiting room and tell me she loved me. She wrote me letters. She put money in my commissary account so I could have small comforts. She waited for me. And when I got out, she took me into her home, helped me rebuild my life from nothing. Daniel's voice grew thick with emotion. My mother showed me that love isn't just a feeling, it's a choice, it's a commitment, it's showing up over and over again, even when it's hard, even when the person doesn't seem to deserve it. She chose to love me through the worst period of my life, and that choice saved me. It gave me a reason to change, to become better, to fight for redemption. He looked directly at the audience. If you're here because you have a loved one struggling with addiction, if you're wondering whether to stand by them or walk away, I can't tell you what to do. Every situation is different. But I can tell you that my mother's choice to stand by me while still holding me accountable, while still expecting me to do the work of change, made all the difference. Love and accountability can coexist. They must coexist. The audience applauded, and several people approached Daniel afterward with tears in their eyes, sharing their own stories of loved ones lost to addiction or crime, thanking him for his honesty and his message of hope. That night, Daniel went home to Lisa and their daughter. Little Margaret, now 10 years old, was doing homework at the kitchen table. How was your talk, Dad? She asked. It was good, sweetheart, Daniel said, kissing the top of her head. I told them about your grandmother. I wish I could have met her, Margaret said wistfully. Me too, baby, Daniel said. But in a way, you do know her. Every time I help you with a problem instead of solving it for you, that's her teaching. Every time I tell you the truth, even when a lie would be easier, that's her example. Every time I tell you I love you no matter what, that's her love. passed down through me to you." Little Margaret smiled and went back to her homework. Daniel sat down beside her, and Lisa brought them both tea. They sat together, a family built from the ashes of terrible mistakes, held together by the legacy of a woman who refused to give up, who chose love over judgment, who believed in second chances. Did you like the story? And which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. If you like the story, you can support me by sending a super thanks so I can keep bringing more stories like this. Thank you so much for your sweet support. I'm looking forward to your comments on the story. On the screen, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend. There's so much more on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story with love and respect.